Thank you, Mira, for the introduction. And thank you, Susan and Salt, for inviting me to contribute to this conference. So my talk is titled Performance Art in Southeast Asia. And I'm going to talk, and this talk will be divided into three parts. The first is I'll talk briefly about the development of performance art in Southeast Asia. The second part, I will focus on performance art in Singapore, in particular an event called Artists' General Assembly as a case study for thinking about the role of archival documentation in the writing of art history and social history. In the third part, I'll talk briefly about a project called Artists Investigating Monuments, which I think will resonate with our current movements to decolonize public discourse institutions and spaces. Performance art practices in Southeast Asia span a wide range of practices and genealogies beyond the Euro-American definition of performance art. These performance practices intersect with live art, body art, dance, demonstrations, street theater, and social protests. And you can find some of that documentation in some of our collections at Asia Art Archive, such as the Li Wen Archive, the Ray Langenbach Archive of Performance Art, and the Green Papaya Art Projects Archive. Artists in Southeast Asia combine ideas about performance art with their observations of local issues, locally available materials, and local practices and rituals. Over the last 4 decades, they have developed a substantial network to exchange their ideas through artist collectives and festivals across Asia and around the world. Artists use performance to break from the conventions of institutional training, to disrupt dominant narratives, and to create their own networks. Artists have embraced performance practices for a variety of reasons. It's economical, it doesn't require much in material. It can be done anywhere. As a form that allows for improvisation, performance is a means to evade censorship. As societies across Southeast Asia have become gentrified, performance also has become a way to critique the commodification of art. Performance can be an enactment of protest that takes place in the theater, on the streets, in a private setting, in a cafe. We see this, for example, in works done by artists such as Donna Miranda. Here you see a slide for a project that she did called Scores for National Democracy. This was an archive of resources that she put together that covers the 50-year-old National Democratic Revolution taking place in the Philippines. The archive contains documents from the legal mass movement and the revolutionary underground in the Philippines. She assembled this collection of documents to understand a history of systemic efforts to redistribute power and resources. And she compares these documents to music scores that shape a revolution that, quote, offer directives for future use and traces of past actions, organizing bodies in a system of movement that enables them to take their place in history, unquote. And you can learn more about this in a program that we did recently, a few months ago, called Life Lessons, number 9, which was a conversation that Donna Miranda did with another artist activist named Shahido Alam. So the first project that I'll talk about was a project that was co-organized by an artist collective named the Artist Village. Performance art has been a significant part of the development of contemporary art in Singapore, and one of the most important collectives in that movement was the Artist Village. TAV was a collective founded in 1988 by Tong Da Wu. The Artist Village was unique at the time, offering artists open studios and facilitating group conversations. In a social environment that favored academic painting within art institutions and among the public, the Artist Village emphasized process and exchange rather than product and individual creation. Tang Wu, the founder of TAV, was known for questioning social practices in Singapore, such as the use of exotic and rare animal parts for claims of medicinal benefit. For a public performance called Tiger's Whip, he enacted the characters of the aggrieved spirits of deceased castrated tigers, the hunter, and the consumer. One of the Artist Village's most important collaboration was Artists General Assembly, which they co-organized with Fifth Passage. It was a week-long festival that was organized at Fifth Passage Contemporary Art Space in Singapore. AGA took place from December 26, 1993 to January 1st, 1994. Among the many projects and screenings of videos, AGA included 2 performances that became sensationalized spectacles in the media. A series of events would lead to the National Art Council's de facto policy of not funding performance art in Singapore for a decade. Artists organized the festival as a critique of the state's policing of people's sexuality. There had been a series of crackdowns, the most notable being a police raid on a bar known to be frequented by gay men. That event happened on September 23, 1993. Dressed as undercover, police entrapped a dozen men for alleged sexual offenses and passed their names and professions to the press. A newspaper published their private details as an act of public shaming. 6 men pleaded guilty and the rest claimed trial. Those who pled guilty were sentenced to jail terms of 2 to 6 months and beaten with 3 strokes of the cane. From December 26, 1993 to January 1st, 1994, artists organized the Artists General Assembly at the Fifth Passage Contemporary Art Space. The week-long event featured a variety of artistic projects, installations with 12 wooden boxes that looked like coffins, impromptu sound performances, performance art, and a video program. The artist Li Wen gave an improvised musical performance with the lyrics, quote, "We've got democracy, but not chewing gum," unquote. The tongue-in-cheek phrase referred to the Singapore state's prohibition of chewing gum in public, an illustration of the Big Brother policing of social behavior. Khairuddin Hori gave a performance called Visual Play in Process, for which he dressed in drag and wore striking makeup, bringing into stark relief gender norms on how one can dress and look. Zai Kuning gave a particularly provocative performance with 2 dead chickens, one sitting in front of him and one behind him. Slowly, over the course of about 30 to 45 minutes, the artist casually takes off his clothing one by one. Then someone hands him a video camera, after which he stands and puts it in front of his penis. He slowly walks around the audience, pointing the camera at them and seemingly recording them with the camera propped in front of his penis. This conjoining of sexuality and a technology of surveillance critiques the media sensationalization of people's private lives and bodies. The dead chickens allude to a common Chinese proverb, quote, "Kill the chicken to scare the monkey," unquote, which teaches that authority comes from making an example of someone or something. Artists General Assembly included a curated show of experimental videos by Ray Langenbach, who in the end wasn't allowed to screen Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied and 2 other videos for their supposedly homosexual content. Many of the AGA projects were provocative, but 2 artists would be singled out. For her performance, Shannon Tam burned news clippings of sensational media articles about the police actions. She then ate the burned news clippings. The performance that attracted the most media attention was Joseph Ng's brother Kane on January 1st. In response to the police raid on September 23rd, 1993, Ng performed a mock cane beating of the men in public. At the front of a narrow runway, he laid down 12 wooden boards, each covered with a news article about the raid. On each board, he laid a piece of tofu and a plastic bag with red liquid. He then spent the next few minutes pacing and dancing back and forth along the runway. Finally, he approached the semicircle of tofus on boards and methodically struck each piece of tofu with a cane, enunciating the phrase, 3 strokes. With the last stroke, he walked to the back of the runway, turned his back to the audience, lowered his briefs, and took a pair of scissors. He seemed to snip something. He pulled up his briefs, walked back to the front of the runway, and laid down a small bundle of hair. The audience never actually saw what was doing, nor where the small bundle of hair came from. He would later be accused of indecent and obscene behavior in public. 2 days later, on January 3rd, a local tabloid ran an article about Ng's performance with the headline, "Pubic Protests or Public Protests." The performance also made headlines in the Chinese language newspapers. The media coverage created a scandal that became a problem for the National Arts Council, the government's funding body for the arts. A day later, after the headlines, the National Arts Council released a public statement to the media condemning Ng's performance as, quote, vulgar and debased. On January 6th, the Singapore police charged Ng for cutting his pubic hair in public, calling it, quote, an obscene act, unquote. On May 16, Ng appeared in court initially to plead not guilty. At the time, he was fulfilling the mandatory military service for all young men, and so the judge asked him for conference in his chambers and advised him to plead guilty to avoid possible double prosecution in civil and military courts. Ng pled guilty and received a fine of 1,000 Singapore dollars and prohibition from ever performing in Singapore again, which stands to this day. The event had tremendous consequences for the arts and the public community in Singapore. The manager of the gallery received a fine of 700 Singapore dollars and had to close the place. The National Arts Council instituted strict requirements on artists receiving public funding. For performance art projects, they had to submit a script. If they went off script, they had to return any funds received from the NAC. Performance art, in terms of official announcements of performance art, would be restricted in Singapore for a decade. Although it was not official, it in fact was a de facto ban on public funding of performance art. The second project I'd like to talk about is Artists Investigating Monuments, the first iteration of which was in 2000. For this project, I will only focus on a few artists. Artists Investigating Monuments in 2000 took place at 3 sites of national formation in Singapore: the Raffles Landing site, Merlion Statue, and Hong Lim Park, or otherwise known as Speaker's Corner. Artists from the Artist Village and other artists initiated this project as a way to think about public monuments and official histories. They wanted to ask what were the possibilities and limits of the public sphere, both in terms of discursive and physical spaces, and what was the efficacy of performance? What can one say and do in public? What public actions are possible? We may think about this project in terms of what were the consequences of the de facto ban on performance art in Singapore. Artists Investigating Monument brings up the question of using the absurd, the impractical, and the non-productive as ways to ask the question or to find the contours of public society and of the body politic. Artists Investigating Monument was started by the Artist Village and continued in several iterations and locations. It was a project that was initiated by a younger generation of artists who had bore the brunt of a period of reduced state funding on performance art. It included 16 artists who created responses to the 3 locations mentioned. And it was also accompanied by an exhibition at the substation, which is one of the most important spaces of contemporary art in Singapore, and which recently has been deprived of its physical space. So the performances that took place at Raffles Landing site were a response to the statue of Sir Stamford Raffles. Raffles was the British officer who led the invasion of Java Island, which is now a part of Indonesia, and he would later lead the colonization of Singapore and the Straits settlements. One of the artists who participated in this response was Li Wen. Originally, he proposed an iteration of his project known as Yellow Man. So he was going to create Yellow Man as a person who would respond to the statue, but instead he revised the proposal to invite participants or members of the public to join him in this response. So he created a scaffold that was 2 meters high on level with the base of the statue's pedestal. The scaffold stood at a 3-meter distance from the base of the Raffles statue. And Li Wen would invite audience members or any member of the public who was passing by to join him on the scaffold. Usually people stand at the ground level and look up at the statue, which towers over them. And from that ground, Raffles is standing on a map, and there's a plaque in front of the statue that reads, that proclaims him as a, quote, genius who, quote, changed the destiny of Singapore from an obscure fishing village to a great seaport and modern metropolis, unquote. But when audience members stand on the scaffold at eye level with Raffles, they started to notice certain things about him that they couldn't see from the ground. And one of the things that this project brings up is what happens when one changes one's location of perception, what can be seen and what can't be seen. Another artist who participated in the project was Jason Lim. He had proposed the project, but later withdrew it. However, on the day of the performances, he unexpectedly did an intervention, which turned out to be a kind of mock confrontation with Raffles. We can see him yelling at the statue, throwing his slippers at the statue, throwing his shirt, mooning the statue, doing things that seem totally absurd and comical. Another performance that also seems absurd was a collaboration between Lam Hoig Lee, otherwise known as Kai Lam, and George Chu. For this collaboration, Kai Lam pumped air into balloons, blew inflatable globes, clapped large cymbals together, and put a cymbal in front of his face on his head. George Chu threw things. He improvised a dance. He twisted his body in various shapes. He crawled. He walked around. He climbed on the scaffold. One could say that all of these actions seem ridiculous and nonsensical. George Chu said, quote, My work is based on the individual body in connection with dance that struggles to slip through the controlling hands of, quote, conquerors and political bodies, unquote. The unscripted, the informal, the nonsensical, within the space of official story making. These are the stories that these bodies tell us. They stretch the contours of their own physical bodies as a metaphor for stretching the contours of the national body. The symbols clashing, disrupting the demeanor of calm and propriety in the making of official narratives is the sound that we hear emanating from these bodies. Archives can be depositories of power and nationalist historiographies. They can also, especially those collected by individuals, be depositories of obscured and almost lost histories. They can help us to recover voices of protest and dissent, and they can remind us of the historical precedents for concerns that continue to be relevant in our time. And one of the projects that came out of that survived in a way or succeeded the legacy of the de facto ban on performance art was a festival called Future of Imagination. And so after about a decade of the de facto ban, the National Arts Council opened up proposals for government funding again. And so Li Wen, Jason Lim, and Kai Lam got together and they applied for funding to initiate a festival that became known as Future of Imagination as a way to test whether the government was serious about funding public performance again. And they used that funding to invite artists from around the world to create a festival that would last from 2003 to 2015. How do young artists react to these performance pieces on public space? So at the time of the artists investigating monuments, the artists weren't allowed to publicly announce performances, in any official way. And so the only way that they could announce their events and their projects was through word of mouth. And so there wasn't a lot of in-person attendance necessarily. But I think that artists investigating monument went on to be very important just in terms of a model for artists to engage with socially and politically sensitive topics, right? In a way that wasn't necessarily overt, but that one could read between the lines. And yes, the Artist Village was very much connected to a whole web of festivals. And we can see that in the Li Wen archive, for example. So the archive right now online has almost 2,000 records, but as you can see, more than half of those records are actually documentation of festivals. Li Wen was known as a performance artist, but he was also a really important arts organizer. And so he was an active member of the Artist Village. He co-founded Future of Imagination. He also co-founded Rights, which was a festival that supported sound arts or noise. And one of the things that he did was that whenever he traveled for festivals, he not only documented his own work or saw to the documentation of his own work, but he also was known for documenting the works of other artists. And I think this generosity in terms of supporting other artists was also something that his peers shared with him. And so it was through the festivals that they shared their practices, but that they also shared what was going on in their own communities. This is a question from John Teen. John says, You contrasted towards the end the official archive with unofficial archives, and I was wondering if you would say more about the efforts of Ray Langenbach and Li Wen as archivists, guardians, and mediators for preserving the histories of their fellow artists. Yes, so like I said, yeah, I think that Li Wen and also, of course, Ray Langenbach, who himself is a performance artist, but also a really important arts organizer and a professor. You know, Ray taught performance art at the university level for several decades. Both of them were part of a community of artists, not only in Singapore, but I would say throughout Southeast Asia and many parts of Asia, where artists had to wear many hats. Right. And so they weren't just artists, but because there wasn't enough of an infrastructure, or because they saw that there were gaps in the infrastructure that they wanted to see, they were active not only as artists, but also as organizers, as people who documented performance art, as people who organized conferences, as people who wrote about performance art, you know, who theorized about performance art. And so the Ray Langenbach archive and the Li Wen archive, like many archives on contemporary art in Asia, I think that you'll see that there is documentation by various people that cover all of these activities. Yeah, and it's in that overlap of activities that they took it upon themselves to create an infrastructure that wasn't necessarily being created or supported by institutions. Yeah, and by that I mean museums, universities, exhibition spaces. Yeah, and so they took the initiative to build this infrastructure. And I think that the institutions that we have now, you know, in Singapore and in other parts of Southeast Asia, learn from these artists, and we wouldn't have these museum or exhibition spaces without the work that had been done by these artist collectives. There's another question. Are there studies similar to South Korea's Hallyu policy? And then there's a question. Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. Could you give some information about the funding system for performance art? I mean, before the limitation, the de facto ban. In terms of funding in Singapore, the National Arts Council is a very powerful organization, right? It's rare to come across a project or a space that isn't in some proportion funded by the National Arts Council in Singapore. Right? It was true in the 1990s, and it's true now. And so when the NAC withdraws funding, that is a significant proportion of your sources. Yeah, so I think it's because of that performance art became an even more important practice for artists, you know, because you don't need to buy canvas, you don't need to buy paint, you know, you have your body. You can perform impromptu, you know, in public or in someone's apartment, you know, whatever spaces are available for you. And, you know, in places, say like in Vietnam, for example, performance art also emerged as a very important space for artists to critique authoritarian policies, you know, or certain social practices. And because they didn't have material, you know, and it was a way for them to do an action very quickly, and then that was it. It didn't have to be documented. It could be something that a few photographs, if someone did snap some shots, would circulate within the community, and it would be a source for a conversation that went beyond the moment. And so I think that performance, we can think about how it's something that it's important not only in the moment itself, but it's in the aftermath, in the circulation of those ideas and of the conversations.